I'm really glad you can get in. We did that one program with Isidore. How is he okay?
He's great. He just called me. He's down in Florida.
Okay.
And he's advancing all his academic interest right now.
Oh, right, as well as the film going?
Yes, absolutely.
Good deal. Well, anyway, we're going to talk. It's really good to welcome you to conversations and everything. We can try to get things straight and everything as far as the world's concerned, which needs some interpretation, perhaps. And welcome very much to Conversation. Pleasure to welcome to the program Neil Berro. And Neil Berro is down as a public intellectual and a writer. And I know he has a column that he writes on a regular basis for a Connecticut newspaper.
New Haven Register.
New Haven Register. And he's a person who's been watching the Middle East for a very long time. And all the events that have been going on recently, we had a few exchanges. We said, well, why don't we come in and talk about it and so forth. And I'm glad he's been able to do it. Neil, welcome very much to Conversation.
Thank you, Harold.
I wonder if maybe you could. We did a program with you and Isidore
Rosmarin.
Rosmarin.
Back in February.
Right, back in February. You made a film about the Middle East, and you were helping with that. But maybe you could share your own background, a little bit, born and raised, a little of that education. And then we want to talk about, there's been all these events in Lebanon and everything. We want to talk about, you know, the situation in the Middle East and Israel and so forth. But your own background, please.
Well, I was born in the sun and fun capital of the world, Brooklyn.
Brooklyn. Oh, I was thinking Tucson, I was thinking Phoenix, and yeah.
We moved out to the island. Always a paradox, because Brooklyn is, of course, a part of Long Island, but, you know, you got the suburbs and the city.
Yeah.
And I was raised out there. And
where out there, if I may?
In the Five Towns, in North Woodmere. I had a very strong sense of my Jewish identity and background.
Right.
I think my ancestry is a little bit unusual in that I'm what you would call a Sephardic Jew.
You're Sephardic, okay.
And my family in particular goes back at least 500 years and probably more. Prior to the expulsion from Spain, we go to the island of Rhodes.
Wait a minute, you go back 500 years before the expulsion in 1492?
Okay, I didn't explain that. The family lived on the island of Rhodes for at least 500 years.
In the Mediterranean?
In the Mediterranean following the expulsion. But Berro, which is a Spanish word, it means watercress.
Okay.
And that actually ties into our entire theme, because there are many Lebanese Berros, Arab Berros. There are many Jewish Berros. There are still many Spanish Berros. And in the course of dealing on the internet and Googling names, I came across someone in the Michigan area who is from Lebanon, who's an Arab with the same last name. We began corresponding with each other, and I wrote several pieces on it in several different journals, the point of which is that whether you say shalom, whether you say salam, the hope and the guiding principle of peace and moderation among all peoples, it can cross names, it can cross ethnicities, because these Berros, in all likelihood, whether they're of Jewish or Muslim or Christian currently practice, they all basically trace back to the days in Spain. I've internalized that to a very great degree, because it seems to me we're wasting a lot of the world's energy in futile conflict and violence, when we can convert modern technology to actually helping people and moving past horrific moments of potential great destruction.
Yeah, one of my favorite lines I use too much, but it's James Joyce having Daedalus say, history is a nightmare from which I'm attempting to awaken. And in a certain sense, this could be a time of awakening to a liberated order that has not been characteristic of the historical context except intermittently, unfortunately, but it's a time of great opportunity for improving for everyone the human condition.
And you know, Harold, again, because I've watched a number of your programs, and I follow you also through the internet. It seems to me that it is not a waste of time. It's a very productive use of time for us to step outside of the moment where we currently live. We all make the mistake of thinking that the current era we live is somehow the best of times or the most advanced of times, when in fact we're constantly repeating the same mistakes, the same...
Santillana, I think, was a Spaniard, was he not? Yeah, who said it.
We're constantly back in this environment of bringing us back to open up any history book of violence and bloodshed, and you have to ask yourself, can't we do better? But to finish just the narrative of my own background.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I basically grew up in a typical baby boomer, grew up in the 1960s. I have an older brother who was the classic kind of forerunner, firstborn. I was the more typical secondborn. So
I'm not sure what the classic firstborn and the secondborn
I let him get punished
in a Jewish condition. Oh, I see.
I let my brother get all the hits from my parents, and I was kind of content to kind of be the good boy.
You were the goody-goody, huh? Yeah.
I was the goody-goody, and that kind of works for a while, but it's not. You can't go through your whole life that way.
That stick doesn't go all the way home, right? Yeah, right.
No.
Yeah.
My brother is a remarkably successful businessman today, and.
Right.
But he got me interested, I think, in politics and watching the news, and I gravitated towards the world of politics and the world of media. Before we called it media, before there was media in the consciousness, it was reading a newspaper, it was watching the television news, and I began to understand intuitively, not as an expert, how phenomenally important the role of how the story is told and shaped becomes
the narrative.
How is the narrative formed? So I don't have a scientific bone in my body. I don't have a mechanical bone in my body. But if you ask to understand sociology or political science or great mega trends and movements, it seems to me that the impact of media has very profound implications for all of us. So I have spent most of my career trying to help communicate story and trying to help to communicate narrative.
That's what you were doing with Isidore.
And that's what we did in the film, and even in the context of when I write publicly, I'm extremely conscious that whatever my personal, absolutely private views on a matter, like an opinion, like after a beer or two, that's, and we're not talking Mel Gibson.
Yeah, okay.
We're not talking a Mel Gibson beer or two.
Right.
We're not. I am conscious of the fact that people need to hear and understand how these stories relate to them in their own context.
Absolutely, how important they are in terms of various notions. I wonder, back to your family thing, you got 500. Have you traced that in terms of the records and so forth? They have this capability, I guess you're aware, of the DNA being able to do it. Have you ever run a DNA test on yourself or anything?
No.
They can do it for a matter of a few tens of dollars, and you can get a reading back 1,000 years about your background. And it's very interesting. You haven't done that, but you've done reading church records and so forth to get that back 500 years and so forth?
Well, I don't know if it would be church records, but it would...
Or whatever.
Or
synagogue records, maybe in your case. Sorry. Being a WASP, I have this problem, you know.
I believe, as best I understand the narrative, that we were the third oldest Jewish family on the island of Rhodes.
Wow.
And that we absolutely trace our ancestry prior to 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but the Jews got also kicked out of Spain.
They did.
We trace our ancestry to Spain. Now, when the Jews were excused from Spain, they kept on moving eastward, some going as far as India, and others settling in Iraq, other parts of the Middle East, many along the North African coast, and that really helped to develop and spur on...
there were rumors that Muammar Gaddafi was Sephardic. There have been rumors to that effect.
How about General Franco of Spain? My first cousins are Francos.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
A very common, extremely common Sephardic Jewish name from the island of Rhodes.
I'll be darned. Really?
In fact...
Franco,
F-R-A-N-C-O. In fact, again, this is not my area of expertise, but as an amateur student of the process, I have heard more than once that upwards of 10% of the European population has some Jewish ancestry in their blood.
10% of the European, that East and West European?
Yes. That includes Spain, that includes...
Russia?
Yeah, sure.
Caucasus and that? Yeah, okay. That's interesting.
Upwards of it, but
upwards 10%. And would that include Israel?
Well, I mean, there you're back into a DNA question where, in fact,
It'd be interesting to get a D. I think I'm going to get that done to see, because I have high cheekbones. Do you think? See, I'm English, right? But don't you think I have kind of high cheekbones?
Well, how far
I think
back?
I'm a descendant of Genghis Khan. I think I must be. But if you get a DNA test, you can actually, I don't know, but you can actually get a reading of it. It's really an interesting thing that's become available to the citizens now. A lot of African American people are interested in that, to find out. A lot of them, they had their identity stolen from. They want to know, where are they from. They get a DNA. You're from Yoruba, or you're from there, and that's your. And they can read it scientifically from the DNA. You could get that for yourself.
The only piece I have is
you just take some squab, from inside your, send it off, and they'll tell you your background in scientific terms.
In
maybe
fact,
you should do that by the time you go home tonight. Or maybe I should too.
You know, in fact, I have a very dear friend in Ohio whose relative is an academic. See, my friends are academics, but I don't have relatives who are academics. And he does, and he is a very prominent relative from Arizona who did a lot of the seminal studies on Semitic roots and ancestry via DNA study and testing.
Really?
So about 10 years ago, you should know, I did in fact participate in one of the studies, and I never did get the results on it. So
why didn't you get the results?
I don't know, but maybe I can contact my friend and see if they still have my specified swabs.
No, it's becoming for everybody now.
But ultimately,
yeah.
The human condition in the 21st century, if we actually have the nerve, the gall, to claim we're making any form of progress, if we don't find a way to turn back the clock against the ticking sounds of encroaching mega violence, trust me, the day will come where no one of any faith or background in living in any part of the country is going to feel particularly safe or secure. I mean, as it is, how are you getting on airplanes these days? Taking off your socks, your shoes, you know. I mean,
now
this
you
is like
can't
crazy.
take hair lotion with you and everything because they
we
got
went
that
to
thing?
we went to the ball game last night. Okay, as
Yankee Stadium.
Went to Yankee Stadium. As we're going in to hand our tickets in, my daughter and I had a bottled water with me. The attendant, who looks like he went back to the Babe Ruth era.
Yeah, big fellow,
The attendant
Bambino,
says, the attendant says to me, you need to sip the water before you go in the stadium. So what did I do?
Welcome to the brave new world.
What did I do? I gave the water to my daughter, so just in case the water was explosive.
You knew she could handle it, yeah.
I mean, is that the kind of world we want?
No, it's really something. And these are really exciting and interesting times. People have thought that. I just want to go one more line. You said your interest in that, was it intellectually stimulating, the family setting and that sort of thing? That you picked up these intellectual or academic interests? What was the family setting like? And
my dad,
you grew up in that.
My dad,
I think that's really important, the family setting, in terms of character and intellectual development and so forth.
You know, I'll tell you something. My grandfather, who was all of 5'1",
big fellow.
Yeah. And a tiny fellow. In fact, my mom used to say that when they went shopping for him in his later years, they had to go into the boys' department.
Right.
He was the immigrant, and he probably, as best I understand it, came from a fishing background.
Right.
When he came to America, he worked at one of the old Madison Square Gardens selling candy.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
My dad was one of 5 children. Was the first to go to college. In fact, the other siblings helped him financially to go. Became a certified public accountant.
Okay.
And my brother, kind of ironically, is a major distributor of sundries of much the same things.
Like your granddad.
That my granddad used to go up and down the stairs of Madison Square Garden selling.
Yeah.
On my mother's side of the family, they were very different. They were of more Central European descent, Austria, and settled in Michigan.
So you're part Sephardic.
Well, but since my last name is Sephardic and I was raised in a Sephardic synagogue.
But your mother is Ashkenazi.
Yes, true, but we always culturally identified with the Sephardic side.
That's interesting. I want to find out the difference because I don't know well.
The
But anyway,
Ashkenazi...
finish out with your mother's side.
On the mother's side, they settled in the middle of the country, very Americanized.
Where?
In Detroit.
Detroit, that's where I'm from. I'm from Detroit.
And in fact...
Detroit.
My mom was not well-to-do at all, and they lived on the, quote, wrong side of the tracks in a... And I'm going back in the era when Detroit had a lot of organized crime. Maybe you remember some of these stories of, the Purple Gang and things.
Purple Gang, they
Murder,
had...
Was it Murder Incorporated? Was it Detroit?
Well, they had probably a chapter there and everything.
But she lived in a Syrian Arab neighborhood, and she used to take the trolley car for a nickel over to the Jewish Community Center, and they had a very small, I saw photographs of it, it couldn't have been more than 20 feet long, if that, a little luncheonette during the Depression. Her dad, my mom's dad was a veteran of World War I where he was gassed during the war. Did not pass away of that, but by the time he reached his 30s, all the complications set in.
Horrible stuff.
And he passed away at a young age. And so my mom and her mom basically were left to fend for themselves. And then they came to New York
in Detroit.
In Detroit.
You ever hear of Dexter Avenue? That used to be a place where there's a lot of Jewish delicatessens.
Is that right? But they
I remember it well. It was really good. I thought it was great.
Does Thurkel School ring a bell?
No, I'm afraid not. No.
Okay. Well, my mother was a very precocious art town, and she got a scholarship to come to New York.
Good.
And that's where she eventually met my dad, and they went all over the country. And
scholarship in what?
Art.
Art. Okay,
yes,
good. So you got art on that side. Yeah. Okay.
And by the way, my mom in her day, she's also of blessed memory, passed on, but she was reviewed by New York Times and Newsday and various very serious publications.
Painter?
Yes.
Acrylic, oil, or
acrylic and oils.
Big, large. She worked large.
Large, yeah.
Figurative or
kind of real life, and we have many of them adorning our walls right now. And,
okay, yeah.
And these are just very special memories.
So it was a warm. There's a term in Yiddish, I think, if you don't know if you Hamish.
Yes.
Is that Hamish? That means it's like warm, right?
You know what? It
friendly.
was wonderful, but I will be honest with you. That Vietnam War thing.
Yeah.
It did rip our family apart to some extent.
Because you were differing views or something, or what?
It was, you had the draft. My brother was very draft eligible, and we couldn't understand why all this was going on, and why the life of the family was hanging by what draft number you got. It just seemed more than we could understand. And
at a personal level, you were thinking of it. Were you thinking of it in moral terms about the righteousness of the cause or any of that kind of thing?
Let me put it this way. I think the vivid images, and this brings the whole story of what we're talking about.
Your narrative back.
The whole thing about narrative, the vivid images of the first time seeing a war that was confusing, and remember, I was really an adolescent or pre-adolescent at the time.
Yeah.
Seeing a war with out in that leafy, canopy, jungle-type environment and casualties always coming, was it ever ending? And what was the point? And what dominoes? And where?
No questions like that asked in the Second World War. No. That was clear.
No,
Korea was a little foggy, and Vietnam became a swamp.
And if they would have had handheld cameras at Gettysburg and at Omaha Beach, I wonder how any of that would have gone.
Might be worth keeping in mind media in terms of this running narrative we have and so forth. That's all. Now, one last thing, and we want to get down to the current thing, but the Sephardic. Now, the Sephardic were Spain. That's associated with, I think of it as
originally from Spain.
You got Ashkenazi.
Sepharad.
The big branch, I think Ashkenazi. I think Russia, Poland, Germany
Central East Europe.
And then in Spain, and then they were expelled, but some converted and that kind of thing, but they were expelled. And they went toward Africa. Where does the term Sephardic come from?
From Spain. The word Spain. Sepharad.
Oh, is that what that is? Okay. And that's what it's associated. Andalusia, perhaps, in a great era. They had that period. But they had that. So is there a big difference between the Sephardic worldview and an Ashkenazi worldview?
There are some.
Maybe you could straighten that out
for us. I'm interpreting it through an American generational perspective.
Right,
I want to be very clear about that.
Of course.
So, for example, if I was a Moroccan Jew today, you know, they could reference growing up in Casablanca, et cetera, or a Russian Jew growing up in the communism. Those are more fundamental polarities. But I would say that even as an American Jew, having experienced many, many synagogues all over the United States, because I've worked all over the United States, I've worked largely on behalf of Jewish communities all over the United States, and most of them are Ashkenazic synagogues. Yeah. There's
what's the breakdown on a population?
Probably 95% of the American Jewish community is Ashkenazic.
And the world population? Or maybe you don't know.
I would say
Jewish.
I would say a majority Ashkenazic, but not 95% by any means.
Not that high.
No.
It would be a bit more. And then they had that. Okay, that's interesting. But the Sephardic, there were a lot along North Africa and so forth. But what I'm getting at in a certain sense is the Ashkenazi was the overwhelming presence in terms of the Jewish community coming into the modern experience.
Absolutely.
And were involved overwhelmingly with the establishment of the Herzl and the establishment of Israel in 1948 and the Zionist movement.
In that context, yes, but there were, in the 19th century, and of course Herzl's 19th century, there were in the 19th century...
Didn't he come into the 20th?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah,
he did.
Yeah,
Late 19th, early 20th, yeah.
Right.
But I think he died in like 1904. Okay?
He was did he really?
Yeah, he died. He was only 45 years old, I think, when he died.
No kidding.
Yeah.
He was an atheist. He was a Jewish atheist.
I have no doubt of it.
Yeah.
Again, we constantly make the mistake of thinking that our paradigm in the modern context is a novel paradigm. It's not necessarily
right. And it's changing all the time.
That's right. There were in the 19th century any number of Sephardic thinkers and spiritualists and religious leaders who had proto-Zionist feelings and expressions and poetry and things of that nature, but it didn't express itself in a modern political context.
It was always there in the Seder next year. Don't you have a thing where you do the Seder next year in Jerusalem? It was always there. There was a yearning always there, right?
In the death camps, they said next year in Jerusalem.
Right,
yeah.
And over the thousands of years of diaspora.
You
have been saying it every time at the Seder. Is that where it's said?
You go, yes,
what makes this
exactly. You go into museums, and museums can show you Haggadot, the text of the Passover Seder that go back 500, 600, 800 years, 1,000 years, and the words are there. And it always ends with next year in Jerusalem. Because, of course, the Jews have been dispersed so long.
Yeah.
But, you know, there are some minute cultural differences, even through an American prism. I would say the Sephardic experience is a somewhat, my opinion now, somewhat culturally warmer.
Hamish?
Yeah. Hamish is a kind of a Yiddish word.
That's Yiddish, but you know what I mean.
Yes,
you came
of course.
up with the word when I want for it. And I mean, I find that among the Jewish people in spades. It's just beautiful. And there's such beautiful camaraderie and communication, and they're talking, you know, it's a beautiful kind of way of being that I find very, very attractive.
You know, 30, 35 years ago, I'll give you an example. When I made my second trip to Israel, which was 1979, I went with a World Sephardic Federation.
Okay.
And we're talking full, strong Sephardic Jews who have no Ashkenazi bloodline going.
Now, I don't know that distinction very well.
Okay,
I'm Spain, and I mean, you got Andalusia, and you got, you know, I'm thinking Spain, but that's Europe, and I'm a little bit confused.
Okay, but so I went with people, for example, whose ancestry goes back hundreds and hundreds of years on both sides of the family. In the Sephardic world, the kind of Middle Eastern, North African, Mediterranean kind of milieu, not central.
Sephardic is thought of as Middle Eastern and Arabic a little bit more
North African,
and North African,
yeah.
and they have that,
and even Southern,
they have that tone to their things, so that they have a certain more.
And even Southern Europe, by the way.
I saw a thing about Einstein that was on public television the other night, and had Abin even talking about him, and he was a really interesting guy, Albert Einstein. And he was down in Princeton, and he was talking about the Zionist thing, the establishment of Israel. He was very in favor of starting the Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
He was critical.
And he had Ben Gurion came to visit him in his
offered him the presidency of Israel.
Yeah, they offered him, and it was funny. He said, I think it was Abba Even, and he said he had a telephone call from almost panicky. Take me off that. I don't want that. But that he kind of winked at the idea, recognized it and everything. But the thing is, he said he was all in favor of the idea of Israel, but he said it's Jewish people that are there. They're Ashkenazi by and large. They are going to have to be able to, in a certain sense, look east and become part of the Arab milieu. And if they don't, they deserve everything that's coming to them.
Well,
that was one of the things, the way Abba Even said it very eloquently, which I thought was interesting. But the Sephardic are thought of as being more ensconced or more in touch with the tone of the Middle East as we think of it, the Arab and the North African Arab.
Let's frame the conversation. I think
talking about framing.
Let's frame the conversation. Perhaps
that was interesting to me.
Let me frame it just a little bit differently. When I went to Israel the second time in 1979, first time was 1975, I went with the World Sephardic Federation. And one of the big issues at that time, particularly in a milieu still following the Yom Kippur War, where the economy was devastated and there was a sense of national depression years after the fact. Certainly my first time in 1975, it was palpable. By 79, it was starting to come out of it, but the economy was still a fraction of what it is today. You had major serious issues of whether or not Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazic Jews in Israel would marry, would become friends, would become business partners.
There's that much difference.
Well,
what was the difference? I mean,
again, I think it was people's
language.
Well, first of all, you had social economic differences.
Okay, what's the? I don't know who's
you had
what.
You had social.
Who's the
following the establishment of the State of Israel,
almost
literally in May 1948, much of the Arab world it began a series of edicts, decrees, in one form of pressure or another, encouraging their Jewish populations, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Iraq,
to go to Israel.
To go get out of their countries.
Right, because there was that animus, right.
A tremendous animus.
Right.
And in more than one case, in fact, in the preponderance of cases,
those were Sephardic.
Those were Sephardic, and they were not able to take their assets out of those countries. Okay, many of them came quite poor, and
Sephardic Jews are thought of as being poor relative to the broader. I just don't know.
I'm trying to say there is no question that today in the 21st century, the social economic gap has narrowed considerably.
Between Sephardic and Ashkenazi.
Correct. But if you look at, say, the 1948 milieu, or say the 1952, 53, the state's 3-4 years old milieu, you're not talking a wealthy country. You're talking a poor country. In those days, you had significant economic disparity. You had people living in virtual tent cities. For example, this will help your viewers. When your viewers saw all those missiles coming into Kiryat Shmona, okay? Kiryat Shmona has gone.
Is that a kibbutz?
No, that's a border town right on the Lebanese border.
Right.
Gone from total obscurity to being on the cable networks endlessly. The vast majority of that generally less well-to-do community are new immigrants to Israel. They could be Russian immigrants.
Lots come from Russia,
They could be Russian immigrants, but in many, many cases, there's still people who came 30, 40 years ago from Morocco or from other Middle Eastern countries. These are not, jet-set type places to live. These are relatively poor places. And in many cases, the people who couldn't get out of the Kiryat Shmonas and the Metulas were the poor of the poor.
That's always the case. That's the way it was in Lebanon, too.
That's right. They couldn't get out.
Or Katrina. The poor couldn't get out of, or couldn't get out of, the poor have always suffered, right?
Precisely, because in some cases they couldn't get transportation until late in the day, got organized. And Israel is not a cheap place to live. Your major cities in Israel are quite costly.
As bad as New York, or not that bad? Not that bad. Nothing's that bad.
No, but don't forget they're not earning an American economic.
No, but I meant
either.
comparable.
It's expensive. But so you have people living in these kind of outback kind of communities who, to begin with, are there because they can't afford to be living in the more expensive
That's a lot
urban
of
areas.
Awful lot of humanity in general in that situation. We tend to have our glossy magazines tilted toward the affluent and the stars of our system, but most of the world aren't in that position. Maybe 20% are in that upper position in terms of the economies of the world and so forth. And that's part of the reality we ought to keep in mind. Most of the people are struggling. And the trends are not necessarily good. We just did a program today about some of the problems with people of co-ops where you've got nefarious kind of things going on in this country. A lot of people think the wealth is being much more concentrated at the top among a few. Middle-class positions are being lost. Pension funds are being raided. There are a lot of problems where it's benefiting the wealthy and the well-to-do and the powerful at the expense of those of the society that are not in that position. It's a general condition in, I guess, most all countries of the world.
Well, and
it's certainly characteristic of history. There's always been a few people that ran things, the Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar, and then the Roman emperors, and then the kings of the dynastic states, and now we've got the financial lords who are running things now. It's always been a case where there's only a few that are at the top, and most of the people are just affiliators or followers.
look, I love the Yankees. As we mentioned, the Yankees being at the Yankee game.
How about the Mets?
You know, and I grew up, considering where I grew up, you would think I would have been a Met fan, but I started with the Yankees when I was 4 years old, and I've stayed with them. But I will tell you this.
Like to be with the winners?
No, I
I
stayed with the Yankees in the days of Horace Clarke and Jerry Kenny when the Mets had Tom Seaver.
Okay.
To understand me is to know I am a loyal to a fault kind of person. But I will tell you this: I am nervous at the idea that the new Yankee Stadium is going up to replace Park area, which was one of the great lungs of the South Bronx, and now they're putting green space on top of parking garages. And to tell you the truth, while I would consider my politics to be moderate to conservative, I am still very troubled that since I'm very familiar with the South Bronx area where the stadium is, that a lot of good people who depended upon those parks are suddenly now going to have to go take elevators up to 5th floors in order to find green space, and I just don't understand that.
Okay, I don't quite know how that ties into
Well, because you were talking about how suddenly we shifted where the affluent have such significant control, and I'm trying to share with you that I do understand that, and but we were talking about how we have seen on television images, particularly in these Israeli border communities, of so many people who have spent a month of their lives in a bomb shelter. It is a horrible situation. It is a situation which cries and begs out for, to me, one simple understanding, whether you are an Arab or a Jew or a Christian or an atheist or from planet Mars, which is that these images, these framing contexts that we have been looking at, if we conclude that there's got to be a winner here and a winner there, and you have people on both sides saying, we won this war, and the other side says, no, we won this war, if you ask me, everybody lost this war, but only if we can learn from what has gone on, how we need to avoid violence, how we need to find nonviolent solutions, only then can we begin to argue that maybe all people can win, and in fact we can win, because it is so clear to me. You don't have to be living in the Middle East. You don't have to be either Muslim or Jewish to understand the stake in lowering the volume of rhetoric and actual violence behooves all of us. There's an interconnectivity that is absolutely clear and manifest that we have a stake in controlling violence.
I saw President Carter on television the other day, and he was asked, do you think we live in a world of elemental justice, or in a world that the trends are moving favorably toward one of the whole human community, moving toward elementary justice? And he said, of course not. We do not have a world of justice. We have a world of some powerful people, realpolitik, setting up a standard. Paul Krugman had a piece the other day in the New York Times talking about the economy in the United States, that the growth over the last 3 to 5 years, that the benefits of the growth, it didn't even accrue only to the upper 1%. This is staggering. The real growth of wealth, it didn't accrue even to the upper 1%. It wasn't even the upper 1/10 of 1%. The real growth occurred among the upper 1/100th of 1% of the people in the national economy, and they're raiding pension funds, and things are going on now. The system in place, people can adjust to it If you're powerful, you want everyone else to adjust to your narrative, if you're powerful. If you're not powerful, you don't want to adjust to a narrative that is not serving your interests or the people you represent as you watch your children being starved or all that kind of thing. So it's nice to say that, but isn't it necessary that there be elemental justice as part of the system in which you're in if you expect a world where there are not going to be people violently objecting to the rules or the situation?
Then the trick
the
is...
facts on the ground, as those who are in a powerful position are trying to get them to adjust too.
The trick is then, if your perspective is to have any hope of fruition, is to have people share in that narrative of elemental justice.
But they don't.
But they could. You see, because a child on the Israeli side of the border is no different than a child on the Lebanese side of the border. A child is a child. A mother is a mother. A family is a family. And the risk is the same. I do not believe for a second, despite any manner of image one may see of flag waving and banner carrying and chanting and sloganeering and portrait hanging, that at the end of the day, that the civilians on both sides do not want a modus vivendi of reaching a peaceful mutual coexistence. The only challenge to that framework, and it does periodically happen in human history that there is a challenge to that framework, is if someone comes along and says, we do not accept, we cannot accept any accommodation at mutual life, at mutual opportunity. That is the only time in my mind.
Those are revolutionary moments.
Revolutionary, but sometimes it's if you will, understanding a revolutionary by itself is an extreme framing.
Of course.
And Adolf Hitler would certainly be an extremist.
He was revolutionary.
To say, yes.
Yeah.
And someone who comes along and says, I don't care what you think of me, I'm telling you, you have no right to live. I would say we owe it to ourselves to face up to that entity and to that person and not shirk from that.
Most people try to frame the enemy in those terms. We're calling everyone in the world a terrorist now, the United States of America. We're a superpower, hyperpower. It makes Rome look like a cakewalk. We are so powerful. We got military troops.
Rome lasted a long time.
It did, a few thousand years. It lasted a long time.
I don't know how long we're going to last.
But they did, and then for 800 years you had a feudal system with dynastic families in Europe, and people got their identity from the narratives around the identity, the political economic framework. You had kings, you had dukes, and so forth, and there was a whole identity thing. That's what's important for people. They got their identity from that context, and there was developing in the wings an industrial revolution. The Scottish Enlightenment informed the United States of America. That's right. There's a book out called How the Scots Invented the Modern World and Everything in it.
And the tape.
But the American Revolution was there. It was in the wind. You had Voltaire and so forth. And they came, and you had Les Miserables in France, who were suffering under the egregious conditions by which they were treated, wallowing around in the mud while the aristos played fast and loose at the Versailles Palace. And they made a revolution, cut off Louis XVI's head. That was a revolution. The American Revolution was an American revolution, advancing in a certain sense the civilization pattern. And it may be, but we're in a place now, some people, it seems there's evidence that much of the world thinks at this moment, as we talk in August of 2006, never has the United States been in such low esteem around all the world, and it's growing very rapidly now. There are many people who think that the system that we claim, the United States of America, let's say, with our ally, and I want to talk about Israel and the tie between Israel and the United States and so forth, but that we have a system that is in place that we claim is legitimate. We are legitimate. Our system, we are the tide of history. We're going to represent the history. This was also the attitude, wasn't it, of the colonial powers that went and colonized the world out of Europe after they expelled you people from Spain. They went out and colonized the world.
They were competing colonizers. Come on.
They were competing.
Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch.
But in the modern world, they came back after the Second World War from that colonizing attitude.
Because they were broke.
But the boot, well, perhaps, but the boot of the colonizing experience, which had been advanced under white man's burden and all kinds of ideas of progress that we represent, European, let's say, and that represent, they all came back. There are many people who now think that the system that we're trying to say, the United States, let's say, and what allies we have heads of state, plutocratic, running dogs, as the communists would call it, who are in league with us. If you see things this way, they're in league with us
You wouldn't superimpose running dogs on the bottom of the screen, would you?
No. But they had
Tony Blair running dog. I don't know.
Every country, you have a small group that controls everything. They have the wealth, they have the power, and they control everything, and everybody else to do what they say. And then we have that, and they're saying we're legitimate. And anybody who's trying to say that something that we represent, our values, we have 229 years of values. We have certain ideas about what the narrative is. The Israeli Zionists had a narrative that they had that gave them a certain sense of identity and purpose and that sort of thing. But there are many people who are saying now that that group of aristos in Europe that had held for 800 years after the Roman Empire were called the aristos. They were the leaders of that context that had it. That now we are, and that was called an ancien regime. That was an ancient regime that had been in place forever. It's legitimate. They're saying the United States and their allies, that would include Israel, would be particularly so, and we want to talk about that, is an ancient regime trying to put upon the world an idea of how we're going to have the world organized, which is out of date with the zeitgeist. There's something new needed, like there was something new needed in Europe, the American Revolution.
And I
wonder what you think about that.
All right, because you said a lot. Let me try to take a couple of bites out of it. First of all, there's some very, very significant differences between the Israeli presence on the world arena and, as you accurately described, the hyper-power role of the United States. Very profound differences. Much of Israeli impact within the region and around the world through trade, commerce, diplomacy, etc., is on a level that's really unconnected to the United States. It still remains a model in many areas of technology and medicine and bilateral relations, where Israel has significant and far-flung dealings with people who, on a political context, they don't have a lot of agreement with. Okay? And I don't want to lose sight about that. My whole presence on your show is really to put forward the acceptance that force qua force is in fact part of the ancien regime.
Force qua force.
That the idea of problem solving through use of force is very passé. But if it is passé from one perspective, it must be passé from the other perspective.
It's not passé in terms of any realpolitik reading of things, which has been the readings by which things are done, and change conditions on the land are done with the bayonet and tanks and Apache helicopters.
Yes, but if you look at, say, for example, Egypt and Jordan and much of the Arab Middle East, they have in fact reached a point of accommodation with Israel. Now, if we're going to get to a point where the only narrative opposing Israel is a narrative that says the Jews must die, Israel must be destroyed, then you will hear me say that Israel has every right to defend itself vigorously.
By any means possible. Under those circumstances,
look,
it's an
we're still
challenge.
the only people who were tertiated. That's a term you have not heard in the context of World War. We were not decimated. We were tertiated. Decimated is 1 out of 10.
Oh, that's right.
Decimated came out of the Roman destruction of the Roman legions, where 1 out of 10 were killed. The Jews were tertiated. 1 out of 3 Jews on the planet.
Same thing for the Libyans under the Italians. Did you know 2/3 of the 1/3 of the Libyans?
The Ethiopians.
No, not the Ethiopians. The Libyans, by Italian fascists. Over half of their population was decimated. Concentration camps and so forth in a colonizing effort in the country of Libya, but we don't hear about that. But that is the case. That's the fact. You can look it up.
The whole no, I'm not talking.
But that's Libyan Arabs.
The whole purpose of the state of Israel's foreign policy, the only purpose of it, is to reach a level of maturity in its conduct with other nations in a bilateral sense, whereby the existence of the state is not at risk, is not at jeopardy. That is the whole purpose. Israel could have a nuclear bomb for every member of the state of Israel, and the only purpose of that nuclear weaponry is to secure the existence of the state.
Well, that's what the powers say. That's a part of the weaponry system. They got 14,000 tanks. They got Apache helicopters.
No, not 14,000. Maybe
more.
No.
And armored vehicles.
Maybe
they do. Yeah, they do. And they have Apache helicopters from the United States.
Yes.
They got $3 billion a year given to them in the United States in order to assert that with bayonets and overwhelming power and force.
In order to,
and they do that from the United States.
In order to secure their national existence.
Because there's so much animosity directed at them.
And because what's the difference is in the 1950s, when terrorism took place, a bomb goes off in a bus, kids get killed, it's a tragedy, it's terrible, but essentially the weaponry that existed did not go much beyond that level. Today, in the 21st century, once again, I come back to a shared narrative. Yeah. We are living in times fundamentally.
Absolutely couldn't agree
where
more.
Every person, and it doesn't matter where they're living,
right.
Someone could declare themselves, you know, I'm a neutral, I'm an agnostic, I'm a Hindu. I can't even give you a litany if I tried to write it down, of every place of conflict taking place around the world today. There is probably conflict taking
everywhere
place in 30 or 40 countries around the world.
Yeah.
Do you think maybe that goes just beyond the Jews? Yes, the answer is yes, it does. And to me, the battle in the world today is a battle between the preponderance of people of all faith and background, who are the moderates, against handfuls of tiny percentages of people, but handfuls of extremists to whom there are no boundaries or parameters to where they want to take violence. And it seems to me our responsibility as fundamentally moderate human beings, doesn't matter, moderate is a very broad term, but fundamentally moderate, peace-loving people, is to at least assert to extremists that we do not accept your ways. Otherwise, whatever you think, whatever you believe, will be at risk if these extremists take over, because they'll go for you too.
The Jews were a diaspora for 2,000 years, and every day, you said, even back in the year 1000 or 100,000 or something, they were saying next year in Jerusalem.
Correct.
Every year, and they never did. And
some did. Some have lived in
they
Israel.
Could go there and live, but the assertion,
they won.
It wasn't until the assertion of Theodore Herzl and a small group of radical extremists got the idea and began to spread it around to a Jewish world that totally rejected the idea that they ought to pick up no Mashiach, they ought to pick up no concern for the conditions of the Torah, saying how at the end time there will be universal justice.
Well, that's the Nutri Carter point of view.
No, it's more than that. It's an elevated kind of context apart from the nationalism and the fight that they should be separated from. Pick up and establish, and I got to give them credit for chutzpah, that they were going to be able to establish in an Arab world, a Muslim world of 1.4 billion people, a state based upon Western values in an age with colonial attitudes toward the broader community around them that some in that area see as apartheid, special rights for certain people in that part of the world against 1.4 billion Muslims, and think they were going to be able to pull that off, and did, and that was a radical venture. The establishment of the State of Israel was a very radical assumption and break from a historical pattern. And I just say some of those questions are part of the context in which this thing could be considered, and whether the overwhelming military power that they've had, they could go into Ramallah and put the turret of the tank right into Mr. Arafat's room, and there was nothing a Palestinian could do. Now the thing seems to be that the Nasrallah, the Hezbollah, they were still bombing, instead of not being able to even throw a stone or a pebble against the overwhelming power that the Jewish state had to completely cow that people and maybe extend colonial control over that part of the world.
What exactly would you have preferred? You know,
I just finishing. That the situation, they were invincible. They were as invincible as the superpower of the United States that backed them up and made it possible from the Treasury of the United States. I don't know why, but they did that, and that they were so invincible that everyone had to accept whatever it is they thought had to be the terms by which something would be done in that part of the world, and that may now be changing.
Well, first of all, if it's changing, if it's reaching a paradigm where...
one last thing. In that process, they were able, with this very deeply felt, radical, mock Moshiach idea that they established there, that they say, we'd like to know what it is. I think it should be made clear to the world community something on the order of 200 atomic bombs that they've developed with which they could obliterate or set off a Holocaust that would destroy the whole of the human species because of their narrative. Some of the context of that there's some countervailing force to that that's now manifesting itself perhaps by a world that is not only against Israel, but is strongly against the United States of America that made Israel possible.
You know, Harold, that would be a very compelling narrative if we accepted a fascist point of view. I don't.
You mean that the Israeli experience represents a fascist
No, on the
expansion?
contrary. I think those who want to destroy Israel are fascists.
Why?
Why? Because they are trying to destroy millions of people, a la Auschwitz and a la the destruction of European Jewry in the middle of 20th century.
Okay. That's your narrative.
That's my narrative? How about that's people from Yasser Arafat, Gamal Abdel Nasser, that's Nasrallah, that's your friend in Tehran. That's a narrative of radical Islam, and they are fascist. They are out-and-out Nazi fascists who call for the destruction of the state of Israel.
I think the country...
and to accept the premise or the notion that the Jewish people and the modern state of Israel have not brought some opportunity for people in that region, the Palestinians not the least of which, to re-examine what their social development could be, to re-examine what their hope could be. The Palestinian people could be living on a standard equally comparable to Israelis had they chosen a much more moderate path. And I believe there's numerous Palestinians who feel that way. I believe there are numerous people in the Muslim world who feel that way. The tension in the Muslim world is a fundamental tension between Muslim moderates, who I believe represent the majority of the people, and Muslim extremists, who now are salivating at the possibility of getting nuclear weapons and salivating at the possibility of destroying Israel and killing Jews.
Why is it the United States, or what is it? I mean, this is interesting. Why is it that there's something about the United States of America or Israel, or you could say Britain, that they can have atomic weapons and the rest of the world cannot? I mean, just to address that. Are we civilized? We are civilized and they are barbaric.
No.
Why is it that we can have the power, overwhelming power, and they will do what we tell them to do and we intimidate them? That kind of a view of the world is a Western colonial view that the people of the world only got out from under the boot of, and we better start thinking about having dialogue with those people rather than dictating to them
we
that
should
we
have
represent
dialogue
the side
with
of history.
We should have dialogue with everyone except for those who say, my only dialogue with you is how quickly I can kill you.
Well,
we cannot have dialogue with people who want to kill you.
Well, there's been a lot of killing going on in the bombing of Beirut. There's been killing going on by the people who exerted the force. You know how many people the United States of America killed in Southeast Asia in the Vietnam War? 4 million people we killed. 4 million people died because of our action, our mistake that we made in Vietnam. And nobody, you notice, it's a lesson of history. Nobody, and Mr. McNamara says we made a mistake. And nobody,
we paid a much bigger price than that.
Neil, listen, nobody ever went in the dock or even questioned for being responsible for killing 4 million Southeast Asians for our mistake. The powerful are above the law, or so they seem.
That's not true.
And that's the way it seems, and might makes right, and that's the law of realpolitik, and that's what's been exerted.
Harold, liberal democracies don't live out at that level. We paid an enormous societal price. Lyndon Johnson gave up his presidency. The entire political structure, we had cultural turmoil, social turmoil.
There were no war crime tribunals. But that was a war crime.
And at the end of the day, the handfuls of Nazis who faced justice at the end of World War II, you think they were representative of the issues that the German people went through? The German people will be dealing with the Holocaust for the next 100 years.
And Mr. Ahmadinejad said, who the hell is it that gave such grief to the Jews anyway? Who was it? It was Germany. Why don't we give them Bavaria? Why did they come and take Palestine? That's what he presented. And that is beginning to make a lot of sense to a lot of people. And this Muslim world, remember, you got 4 million Jews in Israel. You got 1.4 billion.
You know what? I wouldn't care if it was 40 Jews in Israel.
Now that's a radical attitude. Public opinion or world public opinion does not have any meaning because you have a narrative that's going to be defended, and you got 200 atomic bombs. It's a very real threat to the possible survival of our species exerted by radical Zionist extremism.
I'm sorry, with all due respect,
that's what a lot of people see.
Harold,
and that's the trend.
If that is what you're presenting, the fact of the matter is that Israel is a legitimate nation who traces its ancestry back from the earliest days of mankind. Always maintained its presence there, always maintained its hold upon the Jewish people, and in fact, by the dint of developing its country and society, enabled many Muslims and Christians to come, immigrate into the society, and increase their standard of living quantumly compared to their standard of living in the countries they came from. And I would add, we're caught up today in the Israeli-Hezbollah situation, but if you look more particularly at the Palestinian-Israeli drama, much of the movement within the Palestinian community, and I remain, at least within that narrative, a hopeful optimist, much of the issues, because of the impact that the two societies have on each other, have had on each other, and will have on each other, much of the understanding within the Palestinian narrative is based upon models and frameworks of government and media and process that they have picked up from the Israelis. And that is a generally more moderate context.
That's the thing. It may be that we've got some ideas that can help advance the world and bring civilization and that kind of thing. That's a general attitude.
And I'll tell you,
We've only got a couple of minutes left.
Harold, here's kind of the point. If by dint of the narrative you have expressed,
that's the one that's emerging.
If Israel disappears,
so it's going to put real pressure on Israel.
There has been pressure on Israel from day one.
No, real pressure. There hasn't. They've had overwhelming power. They couldn't move. They had such overwhelming military power. They became arrogant.
If it disappeared tomorrow,
but what disappeared?
Israel.
Well, if
you would be still confronting radical Islam, whose appetite would only be whetted by that accomplishment. Period. So, and by the way, knowing you as I know you, and you are representative of a progressive thought within, say, Western culture, what's going to happen the next time a Western cartoonist dares to come up with imagery that mocks Islam? Do you want
Jules Verne, maybe?
Do you want every Christian and every Jew living in the West to be subject to threat, subject to threat of radical Islam?
I think not, but I'm not sure that's the way to. One of the problems is, we just got started. I was really interested in the Shania. You're too interesting, Neil. And I mean, all the thing about the Sephardic and stuff, the world's too damned interesting, too much going on. Listen, we run out of time. We'd have to do it again and everything like that, and it's a thing. But I really think there's a trend now. I think that Israel is emerging as a big force of favor. Do you think we should bomb Iran? We ought to run the credits, please, like that. What do you think? There's Cy Hirsch has this week. They think they ought to get Iran anticipatorily like we did Iraq and that, and just because they could be possibly a threat. Do you think we should bomb Iran? That's in the wind now in some of the more radical neocon circles.
Let me put it this way. I think that this fellow in Tehran, the second he has an active nuclear bomb, he's going to find the button.
It's going to be a long time off before they can have a nuclear bomb. Israel has 200 nuclear bombs
and hasn't used them yet.
Well, that's right, and nobody should, because this is the time where we could destroy the whole species. Do you realize it's not just one tribe destroying another? It is the whole species can be wiped out.
You're sounding like Mel Gibson now.
No, I'm not like Mel Gibson at all. It's not well. That's Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein had exactly the same thing to say.
Albert Einstein was a Zionist.
He was not a Zionist.
Yes, he was.
He was not. Look at
no,
he was not a Zionist. No, he was not a strong Zionist. He supported a cultural center, and he said Israel must face to the east. They have not. They have rejected it. They have rejected the context within which they are disliked by virtually the entire world, and it's coming down on them, and the pressure is going to come upon them in the time ahead. There's going to be real pressure put upon them.
I think Israel's more adaptable. I think Israel's more adaptable.
Well, they better be. They may be.
Yeah,
but anyway,
but I think
there's a lot of questions. But the tide is turning, I think, against Israel, and by that conjunction against the United States, which might be the best.